Today on the No Gray Areas podcast, we welcome Naseem Rochette, speaker, coach, and author of The Unexpected Benefits of Being Run Over. Not only was she run over by a car once, but 3 times. And yet, she chose to reframe her pain into purpose, turning trauma into triumph and building an unbreakable mindset. Here we go.
Naseem Rochette, thank you so much for joining us on the No Gray Areas podcast. I'm so excited to have you on here. I want to jump right in, though, and ask you, May 21st, 2018 was what we might call a life-changing moment for you, right? Like I often will say that all of us have these I didn't see that coming moments, but that day for you was definitely I didn't see that coming moment. So can you help our audience understand what happened that day? And then we're going to get into how that changed your life.
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with the short story and then I'll give a little bit of the longer version.
Okay.
So the short story is on May 21st, 2018, I was hit and run over by a car 3 times. The car hit me, drove forward over me, reversed over me, and then went forward over me again. And I was pinned underneath the car.
Wow. Because I was wondering, like, how do you get run over 3 times? But yeah. And your husband was standing there watching this, right?
Yes. So I'll give you the little bit of a longer version.
Yes.
Now. So Pat, it was, that day, when I talk about that day, I like to, let people know what an amazing day I was having. It was a sunny spring day. I was feeling good and fabulous. And those days you just wake up and you're like, I feel great today. And like everything sort of goes your way. I was having that kind of a day.
Yep.
And I get home a little early to have dinner with my husband. I'm crossing the street in a pedestrian crosswalk. He was going to pick me up from the train station. And a car turned and hit me. And Pat, when the car first hit me, I was still standing and I was having such a good day. I thought, oh my gosh, you're hitting me today. I'm having a great day. And everything's in slow motion. So I wasn't really worried. But then the car accelerated. I flew on the hood. I flew down on the ground. The car drove over me. And, my husband was screaming. I started screaming. I was trying to get out from underneath the car. And then the car reversed. And I could hear in my husband's screams and, other witnesses' screams that he was watching me die.
Yeah.
And I knew, and I felt at that moment, I'm not getting out of this, like there's an issue. I shouldn't be run over again. And, in that moment, I had lots of end of life thoughts, reflected. And, it's interesting. I mentioned I was having a great day. I should also mention for me to be having such a great day was kind of a hard fought won victory because I didn't really like who I was as a kid. I was really shy, I paralyzed with fear, didn't really like who I was. I always felt different and uncomfortable, the misfit. And on that day, I had finally liked who I was. I'd become a person I was proud of. I had 3 kids, have 3 kids that are amazing, a great husband, good job. Life was good.
Yeah.
And that was really big for me to be able to appreciate and enjoy that.
Yeah. You refer to that as your unbreakable day. What do you mean by that? Explain to our audience, because I read a little bit on what you mean by that, but I love this. This is fascinating.
So, as you can imagine, the accident was pretty traumatic and life-changing and, really hard on me and my family. But we decided, we didn't want this to be a tragedy. We wanted to reframe it as a happy story, and that wasn't simple. That wasn't easy to do. But one of the ways we did that was by choosing to celebrate the day and the anniversary of the accident as a holiday because I survived. We called it Unbreakable Day. We call it Unbreakable Day. And it's a day where, we recognize and take a moment to appreciate we got through, we navigated something really, really hard.
Yeah.
And we were lucky enough to have, wonderful family and friends and community that helped us. And we take a minute to thank them, for their impact and support in my recovery. And, we've all got things that we've gone through,
Yeah. Naseem, that is unbelievable. That's incredible that you take a day that was such a tragic day And you've turned it into a holiday that your family celebrates it now as a holiday. But like you're saying, that's a shift in mindset, right? Where there was definitely trauma that came out of that. We're going to talk about that some. There's stuff that you had to overcome and work through. But overall, you've shifted your mindset as a family and said, hey, we survived this.
Yeah.
And so we're going to celebrate this and not just look at it as a tragedy alone. That's incredible. How long did it take you guys to get there?
It was a journey. I'm never
Yeah.
going to say it was easy and I, came out of it, with that optimism. But I think, and part of what I love about what you're doing is, I was lucky enough to hear stories of people surviving and thriving after very tough things. So I'd always said to myself, if I go through something horrible, I hope that I can navigate through it, with something positive. And then when I was in the hospital, I miraculously found out that I did not break any bones.
Wow.
And all of the nurses and doctors were, it was a miracle because I'd been run over 3 times. The tires went over me 5 times and I survived. And so they kept saying, you need to pay it forward. And, I had no idea how I was going to pay it forward. And, I could barely open my eyes or walk or move or see. But it did plant the seed that I wanted to, do something to pay it forward, to put a little bit more good in the world and to share what I learned from the journey.
Yeah.
And so that spurred us, me thinking about how do we make it better. But then I also knew that it was our choice to dictate how we want to navigate the moment.
Yeah.
What we had to decide to reframe it.
Yeah. Yeah. That was masterful how you weaved that last line in there, because this podcast is all about choice. And you actually said it was our choice, because we do believe this podcast is built around this idea of the power of human choice, that we make our choices and eventually our choices make us. So you recognize that you guys had a choice on how you're going to look at that event. But I don't want to miss something that you just said, Naseem, that I thought was interesting, that you said you read stories or listened to stories of people that overcame things. But then I heard you say that was before the accident, that you had kind of been doing that. So it was almost like you were preparing yourself, you not knowing that you were preparing for this event, but you were preparing for this event, recognizing that when you look throughout human history, you see people that have overcome some difficult things. And so you recognize it was possible.
I'm in sales. I've been in technology sales for, 20 years, and sales is full of rejection. So, I was fortunate to hear, keynotes of people overcoming things. And I really think having that inventory of stories is really important, before you get into the crisis. I mean, it's always valuable, and part of the reason that I wrote a book about my journey and, that I like to talk about it is so people know, that you can survive what feels like the impossible, that you can, help and survive the impossible, not just when a tragedy happens to you, but when it happens to your family.
Yeah.
One of the things that I learned is that the accident didn't just happen to me. It happened to everyone that loved me.
Yeah. If you don't mind me asking, how old were your kids at that time? So this was 2018. How old were your kids at that time?
13, 11, and 9.
So 13, 11, and 9.
Yeah.
And like you said, they were experiencing the trauma in this as well. And they had to walk through that journey as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a really hard year. I think they really feel proud now how we've navigated it.
You talk about embracing uncertainty, which I really like that, because change is one of the certainties that we have, which is kind of funny to say, right? Like most of us, we fear change. We don't like change. Change is uncomfortable, but change is a guarantee. Uncertainty is a guarantee. I say this often on this podcast, but years ago, I posted something on social media. I said, 5 years from now, you have no idea where you'll be or what you'll be doing. And I thought how silly that is, because I could say a year from now, not 5 years, a year from now, you have no idea what you'll be doing or where you'll be. So there's a lot of uncertainties in life, but you say embrace uncertainty. What do you mean by that?
Well, look, as you said, we don't know the twists and turns life is going to, bring our way. And one of the lessons, the most important lessons that I learned, is that we have, as we talked about, a choice, also how we look at our journey. So early on in my recovery, I learned about the philosophy and art of kintsugi, of taking a broken vase, putting it back together with gold inlay, and accepting and appreciating the cracks as part of the journey. And that gave me a way to talk about, the challenges and issues and things that I was going through, that this is part of my journey.
Mm-hmm.
And I can accept it and embrace it and learn from it and share it, but I can't change it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also by recognizing that and reframing to not be a victim, but accepting the experiences as part of my journey, it was easier to talk about and to share with the other people who were also in my life impacted by this and needed to help me.
Yeah. Remind me, what is that Japanese art called again?
Kintsugi.
Kintsugi. So
Yes.
explain that again because you mentioned it briefly and some of our listeners may not know this, but that is such a beautiful form of art and it fits perfectly with what you're describing. So explain that.
Yeah. So kintsugi is this Japanese art and philosophy of taking a broken piece of pottery, and when you glue it back together, you glue it with a gold inlay. And so you highlight and celebrate the cracks in the vase. You don't try to hide them.
That's amazing.
You think about it as making the vase more beautiful because of those cracks. I actually, early on when I had a lot of scars on my face, I used to wear gold glitter on my scars on my face and my body.
Did you really?
I did, yeah.
Modeling that Japanese form of art.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
My makeup wasn't going to cover it, and I didn't want to pretend it. I wanted to embrace the journey.
And I love what you say, choosing to not be a victim. But that's something that's easier said than done, right? Mm-hmm. Especially with something that's really difficult in our life. And again, all of our listeners at some point have gone through some difficulty. Maybe they weren't run over, but maybe they had a spouse walk out on them or a death of a child, or we've all gone through or they've been fired, something difficult. How do you avoid being a victim? We hear that all the time, like, well, don't be a victim or choose not to be a victim. But that's more than just one day you wake up and say, I'm not going to be a victim. What was that journey like for you in choosing to not be a victim over this tragedy that happened to you?
Hey, we hope you've enjoyed this episode so far. Be sure to like and subscribe to not miss a future podcast. Okay, let's get back to the episode.
It takes a desire to want to navigate out of it,
mm-hmm.
And to believe that there's more benefit in a life where you do reframe it.
Mm-hmm.
And look, I think, we all know people that like being the victim, but I don't think most of us do. I think most of us want to have that strong posture, where we feel in control of our lives.
Yep.
And I think, when something horrible happens, when something traumatic happens, we feel out of control.
Mm-hmm.
But if we start to look at our narrative and build our narrative and reframe the possibilities with positive language instead of negative language, we take those steps forward. One of the things that I did, and look, kind of reframing it into a positive story and finding a victory was not, something that happened overnight. I didn't wake up and say, hey, forget it. All the issues don't matter. I'm just going to be happy.
Sure.
But what I did, and some of the things that I was able to do that I think sustained my, positive or optimistic outlook that I could navigate through was sharing the issues gave me an opportunity to share the victories and the celebrations.
Mm.
So, when the accident, first happened, I couldn't walk, I couldn't see, I couldn't hold a coffee cup. But as I could do those things, I would get excited. I would tell the kids, I would tell my friends, but if I said to you, I can hold a coffee cup today, Pat, you would say, well, why is that news? You only know that's news because I shared that I couldn't.
Yeah.
When we start celebrating and recognizing that momentum, it's easier to believe and to see we're making progress.
Yeah.
And sometimes that progress, and that progress doesn't just help us, it helps, all of the other people in our life that want to move forward too.
Yeah. Naseem, you bring up such a powerful point because I think, what you're saying is that reframing things and looking at things positively doesn't mean that we ignore the negative. Like, that's to your point. When you could hold a coffee cup again, that would mean nothing to me unless I understood the negative that you went through, the difficulty that you went through on why you couldn't hold a coffee cup. So it's not that we're just trying to pretend like everything's good. We're acknowledging the difficulties, which is the Japanese art, right? We're acknowledging the cracks in our life, but then we're putting gold glitter on it, saying even in the midst of this tragedy, though, there's going to be some good that can come out of it.
Yeah.
And even when we can't see it yet. So you're such an easy interview because you just transitioned for me too. Because my next question for you was going to be about taking control of your narrative. And you actually already went there a little bit. You were talking about, what we do with our narrative. So speaking of that a little bit more, you already mentioned it a little bit, but taking control of our narrative, which fits again, where we're talking about the power and complexity of human choice. I believe that we are the pinnacle of creation as human beings, and we're the one thing in all of creation that actually has the power of choice. We don't run on instinct as human beings. We run on choice. And so how do we do that with this narrative that we have?
I think let's just look at Unbreakable Day, reframing that to not as, the day I died or almost died, but as the day I lived. And if we, let's just, kind of use that kind of tough moment that, we've discussed. Everybody has a really tough moment. If we start to even just look at that one moment, or those, 2 or 3 of those life's most challenging days and think about, what did I learn there? How did I actually get through that? Oh my gosh, I did get through that, and start to build an inventory of wins too, of recognizing, maybe I'm a little stronger than I thought I was. And it was so great that, my friends called and, my family called and let me acknowledge that.
Yeah.
And even then being kind to yourself and say, I didn't get through that the way I wish I did, but I did still learn something. And next time I'll need to remember this.
Yeah. I love how you said it reframed from the day I almost died to the day I lived. I would encourage our audience that, again, Naseem has her unbreakable day. All of us as an audience, and me included, I have some unbreakable days too. So I would encourage your audience to do exactly what you did. Write down whatever happened that day. For you, it was the day I almost died. And then start exploring, because you may not come up with the answer right away, but exploring how you can go from the day I almost died for you to the day I lived. So for our audience, the day my spouse walked out on me to the day I fill in that blank, to the day I got fired, to the day I fill in the blank. And it might take some processing to get there, right? I'm assuming you didn't wake up the day after the accident and all of a sudden have that.
No.
Yeah, it took some processing. Yeah.
We actually, we try to make May 21st, an unbreakable holiday, even for our friends and family. And a lot of people, will use that day as a day to celebrate or reflect on whatever it is they've gone through. Maybe it's not on their exact anniversary. But the other thing I'll say that's really important is also to be kind to yourself. I am not the same person I was before the accident. There are some things that I have to do differently, and even that, I need to reframe. And sometimes that's hard. Like, my husband and I used to go to lots of concerts and we would have music playing through the house and, dancing in the kitchen with the kids. I can't do that. I have a traumatic brain injury. I can't have music playing in more than one room. I can't go to concerts. You won't find me at a club at 3 o'clock in the morning anymore. And, sometimes that, at first that was hard, but I've reframed it to say, well, but you know what, now I can enjoy things that I didn't appreciate before.
Yeah.
And you have to be kind to yourself and realize that it's okay if you're not the same person you were before. There can be, lots of new benefits and advantages to this new person with new insights.
Naseem, that was what you just said was something I myself needed to hear. I told my wife recently, I sometimes miss the Pat McCullough I was years ago. And so I needed to hear that, like, be kind to yourself. Because of some of the stuff I went through in the last decade or so, I feel like I lost that guy that was like, I can take any mountain. I can, So I think that's great advice to be kind to yourself, to be patient with yourself. Let me ask you though, give us a few more examples if you're okay with this. Like you mentioned, you have a TBI, a traumatic brain injury. What are some things that you can't do anymore because of that TBI, and some things that you're doing now that you didn't do before? So you mentioned one, like you can't do the music stuff that you used to do, but you saw there's a positive side of that. Maybe give us another example or two.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I used to be a master multitasker, juggling 100 things at a time. My brain doesn't work like that. I need to go deeper and be more focused on a project.
Mm-hmm.
But that, there's some advantage to my ability to get more focused and get more deeply engaged.
Mm-hmm.
And the other big change that's happened is, through this experience, I've also learned to share more and share what I would have in the past called a weakness, a vulnerability, a crack. And by sharing those things, I have, enabled or allowed people to share back with me, which has actually built so much more trust and deeper relationships. And it's been hugely valuable, both personally, but at work. I'm in technology. We work on very large, complex problems that can take months to solve and to work through. And when you can build deeper relationships and get more focused and share and start to recognize the journey where you came from and celebrate the milestones, it's much easier to sustain through difficult times.
Yeah. I love your point that a relationship, any relationship, a marriage, a relationship with kids, relationship with coworkers or friends is not going to deepen without vulnerability, right? It just can't. So to your point, you learn to be more vulnerable through this. And because of that, then the positive side was you have deeper relationships, probably within family and especially as you were mentioning, coworkers and such. So, wow.
We talked about everybody goes through something hard. I found that so many people that I knew, I had known for years, some even decades, I didn't really know. And until I started sharing, what was going on with me after the accident, they had never shared lost jobs or cancers or things that they were dealing with, because that sharing first, that's not something we've learned how to do. And, sometimes I'll talk to leaders and, do, corporate events or speaking engagements. And I will always stress how important it is to share, especially as a leader. If you share first, you set a completely different tone and accelerate the strength of the community.
Why do you think we're so afraid of that? As human beings, some of it might be a cultural thing. I don't know if other cultures struggle with that as much, but I certainly think in our culture, especially if you're in a leadership position, you've got this, I don't know if it's really taught or if we picked it up somewhere, but it's like, I got to lead with strength. I always got to lead with strength. And you're saying, well, leading with vulnerability can be powerful too.
Yeah, I actually say, so, when I give talks, I talk about a strong, broken, unbreakable. How I went from being this very strong woman who juggled it all and liked to make it look easy to all of a sudden being broken, after the accident and where I couldn't do anything. And then learning of this new dimension of strength, which I also call unbreakable, which is about, recognizing that strength can be the strength to let people help you because they need it in their journey. Sometimes I didn't need the help, but I knew that other people were feeling helpless, that other people wanted to take action and actively participate in my recovery. And by letting them help, I was helping them. Wow,
that's so powerful. How do you think that we build resiliency? Like, can you give some practical strategies on how to build resiliency? Because I think that's become a theme as we've been talking. Your resiliency through this, your family's resiliency through this. What are some practical things that we can do before that difficult time comes to build the resiliency we need to make it through those?
one of the things we talked about, recognizing what you've learned in your tough moments. I like to call it, reflecting on your inventory of wins.
Yeah.
Go through wherever you are today in your life. We've all had some challenges, whether we're 20 or 50. Think about what you've learned. Think about the moments that you're really proud of. You're like, wow, I did that. I can remember a second grade contest that I won, for a little invention. And, that still gives me pride. What are those moments? There might be some, when you're young, they might be with your family, they might be your career, but have your inventory of wins. So on those days you woke up and you're like, I just can't climb this hill, you remember all the little other mountains, all the other little victories. So I think it's important to know, have that inventory.
I can see the value of even journaling that, right? I want you to go on here, but just to your point that you just said, maybe even writing down that inventory of wins, right, could be really valuable. And then when you're having a difficult time, go open that up and you can see it in writing, what you thought through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For the difficult times. And honestly, even, if you're interviewing for a job, there are many moments where that, it's good to know, your strengths.
Yeah.
I think another thing is really, remembering, and this is harder, but remembering how your language influences your mindset. I talked about the positive and the negative bias. It can be, I am going to do this because I'm going to get these benefits, or you could say, I'm never going to get that done.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think about the things you want to accomplish and, challenges? Because it's not like, life, some days life is easy, but, many days life is robust and complex and, a little messy, but how do you approach it?
I love that. And it's almost a theme of this podcast. It comes up with so many of our guests that someone says something like you just did. And then I point out, like, man, we have to pay attention to our language, even our internal language, the stuff that we're not saying out loud, but we're saying in our minds, because I don't think most of us would put up with anybody talking to us the way we talk to ourselves sometimes. And that can do such damage. So something that someone pointed out to me, it was probably about 4 to 6 weeks ago, that they're trying to do. And so I started implementing this practice a little bit, and it's the language of I get to. And I just say that now when I get, so in fact, when I was driving to do some interviews yesterday, I said, I get to do this. Like, this is amazing. This is so much fun. And that reframes it. Yeah. So language is so important, isn't it?
It is so important. And, you also bring up the point that, being kind to ourselves is so important.
Mm-hmm.
Just giving ourselves that little bit of grace too. And it's hard to do, but it's really important.
You mentioned inventory of wins, but earlier in the podcast, you had mentioned that you used almost the same phrase. You said inventory of stories.
Yeah.
And I wrote both of those down because you had used those. That's, I think, again, for our listeners, you want something that's going to be powerful in your life. You start inventory the stories that you've heard or read or seen of people that have overcome, and then inventory your wins. And you do those two things, that's going to be powerful, isn't it?
Yeah. I'll tell you, when I was in my, right after the accident, my brain didn't really work. So luckily some of those things were already rooted, because it wasn't like it was easy for me to draw on those memories and to think optimistically.
Yeah. How long was your healing process?
Oh, years. I still have a traumatic brain injury. Outwardly, I went back to work after a couple of months, but, for the first year, I still needed like 16 hours of sleep a night. I was still healing. Yeah. I had surgeries for many years, but after probably, by the end of the first year, you wouldn't look at me and know that I'd been run over 3 times, which honestly sometimes was hard because I looked fine, but I wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just want to say, I'm still recovering from a really big trauma, and my operating system, the way I think, it's all out of whack, and I'm still working through it, but I can't cross the street like you can because I'm having a panic attack. And, but it also made me realize we have no idea what people go through. You
Yes,
can't see it.
yes. And I thought exactly of that when you were describing that, Naseem. I thought, how often is that true where we look at someone and we think they're fine, but we have no idea what's going on internally? If we could see an x-ray of a broken bone, we're like, oh, okay, you got a broken leg. We can see it in the x-ray. But so often with what we're struggling with emotionally or even with our minds or brain, it doesn't show up on an x-ray per se. So we don't know sometimes what people are going through. So it's be kind to yourself, but be kind to others as well. What was because we're talking a lot about reframing things for the positive, but I don't want our audience, which is why I asked how long your recovery was. I don't want our audience to walk away and just think like, yeah, you got run over 3 times and, you spun this for good and now you've written a book and wow, it just sounds beautiful. What was one of your lowest moments?
Oh, well, so there were a lot of complexities, but my lowest moment was probably 4 or 5 weeks after the accident. So, I mentioned I couldn't walk, I couldn't see, I had to have some, surgery on my eye. My face was cut up. I was just a wreck. I had nerve damage, lots of soft tissue damage, traumatic brain injury. And about 5 weeks after the accident, I was at the courthouse and saw the driver. And the driver was maybe 5-6 feet from me and didn't acknowledge me, didn't look my way, didn't say sorry. And up until that point, I held no ill will. She wasn't a hit. She wasn't trying to run over me 3 times. It was a lot of bad judgment. And when I saw her and she had no human empathy or, had made no connection or effort, I lost it. I was there with my husband and my daughter. And we went home and I was a crazy woman. I was screaming at my kids. I was not rational. I just could not control any of my emotions. And I remember thinking, I'm like, I wanted so much to survive when I was under the car so I could be with my kids and back to our happy family. And this is the mom. This isn't the mom I want to be. This isn't the human I want to be. And it was also the moment that I realized I can't do this alone mentally, and that's when I got on antidepressants and anti-anxiety. Because up until that point, I was also saying to myself, you know what? I've got 2 master's degrees. I've got a great mind. I'm a problem solver. I don't need any help.
You can think your way out of this, is what you were thinking, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. But you can't think your way out of everything. That was a really hard lesson. But I feel lucky that I learned it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that gives our audience just an idea again of like, I thank you for sharing that and being vulnerable to share that, because you probably had a lot of other moments like that too, that were just dark moments and difficult moments. And you seem to be such a positive person. And so someone can walk away from this like going, yeah, but she's just, it was easier for her because she is a positive person. But to hear that, to go like, no, there were times where you had to really, really work and figure out how to reframe this.
I'll tell you one other moment that always stands out to me is...
As we're wrapping up this episode, be sure to leave us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment on something you'll take away. All right, let's hop back into the remainder of the episode.
I mentioned I was this, fabulous multitasking mom, kind of got it all done, always worked full time, but, still tried to be there for the kids. About 5-6 weeks after the accident, my husband asked me to fill out a camp form for my 9-year-old. I sat in bed and cried for hours because I was scared to look at the form because I didn't think I could fill it out. I mean, that's, how broken my mind felt.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you're saying, you're still wrestling with some of that and working through some of that. But again, that was months and now it's going on years that you've been dealing with that.
Yeah. But I'm also kinder to myself. When I at work, I will tell my boss or my teams, this is how I can and can't work. If I travel now, I have to admit, look, I might need to get there a little earlier and figure out how I cross the street because, that's a struggle for me. I can't do a very long drive because of, some chronic, back and leg issues, so I just have to think about those things. I don't dwell on those things, but I have to be cognizant, in the way I live.
Yeah, it goes back to that embracing uncertainty, right? Like you have new normals now, and you had
Yes.
to figure out how to live with those new normals. And again, that's part of all of our lives. And sometimes it's not even a tragedy. Like when my kids left home, I loved being a dad. And I was wrecked when they left home. You raise them to leave home.
I
And,
know.
some parents are like, oh, good, they're gone. I was a mess. I would sit and watch videos of my daughter because I made her like a graduation video. And when no one was home, I'd sit on the couch and just cry and watch these things because I was such a mess. But I had to learn to live a new normal. It was you raise your kids, they move on, and now you're empty nesters, and that's a new normal. So what you went through, that was because of a tragedy for you, but that's part of all of our life, is to have to navigate these new normals throughout life.
I love that. I love the way you frame that. The new normal is spot on. And it's something really interesting, Pat. So obviously, the accident was very traumatic, very hard on me and my family. But a few months ago, someone asked me to, chart out the big moments in your life, the positive on top, the negative on the bottom. And it was interesting. I put the accident on the top.
Really?
Because, and I actually thought to myself, wait, what? Why did I put it there? And I realized I've learned so much, and my life has become richer because of what I've learned and how I share now, that I actually, in some ways, feel like it was a magical accident.
That's incredible. So you're charting out the good and bad things, and this goes in the good. This goes on the top now.
Isn't that crazy?
It is. It is. Let me ask you this really quick, and then I want to have people know how they can get a hold of you and get your book. I want to just ask from your husband's perspective, because I'm a husband. I met my wife in 6th grade. We got married at 19. We've been married almost 34 years now. She's the love of my life, my best friend. I cannot imagine standing there and watching this, and that, to your point earlier in the conversation where you're saying it wasn't just me that went through stuff, it was my whole family. What was that like for your husband to think that his wife is dying right in front of him and then have to walk through this journey with you?
I can still hear my husband's screams, and knowing that he was watching me die. And he's a really, not only wonderful, but very kind of calm guy. My friends sometimes say, like, you got to check his pulse. He's so chill.
Yeah.
But it was very hard watching him die, watching me. But I think what was equally as hard is kind of raising the kids during those weeks where they didn't know if life was going to be the same.
Yeah.
And they didn't know if they were ever going to get their mom back.
Yeah.
So I think both of those things together, him having to navigate both of those things, was really, really hard. Luckily we were all able to turn the narrative around into something happy, and so it's like what you hear about childbirth. You never remember how painful it was because you're so happy about the child. I think we're so happy that things turned out okay, that some of the wounds don't feel as painful as, we think they might.
Yeah.
But I will say that, for him, he just still, there's anger at the lack of, he watched the driver make the bad decisions. He can't forgive the way I can. But he also, what also happened, Pat, and so we were married at the time, maybe 15 years, we're almost 25 now. I, at that point in the marriage would always say, like, honey, why am I doing everything? Like, I'm juggling the kids, I'm working, and I need you to do this. And why am I doing it all?
I've never heard that from my wife, by the way. just kidding.
It actually was wonderful, because then I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And he was stepping up and doing it. And what I realized is that I always wanted it done my way and on my timeline. And I had never given him the opportunity to do things.
Wow.
And so it actually really helped our marriage in some way, because I had to realize that I was really kind of part of the problem. I was always saying he wasn't doing things, but, some of it was me not letting him.
That's powerful. Yeah, that's really good. Well, Naseem, how would one of our listeners, how would they get a hold of you? How would they get your book?
So you can get my book on Amazon. It's paperback. The hardcover actually has a little workbook in the back to find your Unbreakable. Or you can do an Audible, and it's me narrating if you want to hear it.
Good.
If you want to find me, you can go to NaseemRochette.com. And if that's too hard to spell, you can go to lifeunbreakable.com.
Okay, lifeunbreakable.com. And we'll put that in the notes for the podcast as well. So if our listeners can just click on that link.
Oh, the book is called, I forgot to mention what the book is called. The book is The Unexpected Benefits of Being Run Over.
The Unexpected Benefits of Being Run Over. I love that title. Yeah, that's catchy. Yeah. What in the world can you have benefits of being run over for? Like, that's why I love that title. But you've shared so well what those benefits are. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I want to finish with the 2 truths and a lie, which is a fun part. It's ironic because we call this No Gray Areas, and now I'm going to ask you to lie to me. It's a fun way. Our audience has listened to you now for about 45 minutes. It's a fun way for us to get to know you a little bit better. So you're going to give me 3 statements. 2 will be truths, 1 will be a lie, and I have to try to guess the lie.
All right. Before college, I trained as a chef in Paris. I learned to ride a bike in my 20s at Burning Man. I got my first tattoo at 44 in a Florida strip mall.
Oh, those are really good. Those are fun. Okay, so you trained to be a chef in Paris. You've learned to ride a bike in your 20s, and you got your first tattoo in your 40s. Oh, man, I'm going to say the chef in Paris I'm going to try to break it down to a 50-50 here. So I'm going to say the chef in Paris is true. Is that true? Is that one of the truths?
It is not.
Oh, you got me. Okay, good.
Lie. I can barely boil water.
You were talking about all these things you juggle and all these things you do. I'm like, I could see her training as a chef in Paris.
Food is not one of them. My first nanny used to say the kids were always skinnier on Monday because I only fed them with love.
That's so good. Okay, so I got to go with the 2 truths. So you didn't learn to ride a bike until you're in your 20s.
No, I learned at my husband. We were at Burning Man, and he bought me a little Barbie bike and taught me, to ride my bike on the playa.
Yeah. Did you enjoy it? I mean, was it something
I
like?
Did. Now I really enjoy riding. I've done like 100-mile bike ride now.
Oh, that's amazing. Cool. And then your first tattoo in your 40s at a strip mall.
Yes. So I had wanted, actually, this is really funny. So I almost got a tattoo when I was in high school, but the tattoo parlor didn't take credit cards.
Okay.
So it didn't happen.
So then you just waited till you're 40.
Yes, exactly. And then so in my 40s, I was really, the first tattoo is a big deal.
Yeah.
And I had been researching, which tattoo artist and what I was going to get. And then my kids, our family went on vacation in Florida. And my husband sees a billboard for a tattoo parlor. He's like, Mom should get her tattoo there. And then the kids were like, yeah, Mom, get the tattoo here. And so, all my grand plans flew out the window and we made it a family event. And actually all week in preparation for the tattoo, because I was so scared of needles, they would jab me with a toothpick. They called it the toothpick tattoo.
Yeah.
The tattoo was not nearly as painful.
Yeah.
It came out beautifully.
Well, did you end up getting one that you're happy about? Because you said you'd put a lot of planning into it. That's a good idea because the tattoo's not going away.
I know. And, I'll say that I woke up the next morning and thought, oh my gosh, what did I do? But I actually love it.
Yeah, good. Well, Naseem, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Loved what you're sharing. I know for a fact that this is going to help our audience. Myself, I've learned some things. In fact, I jotted some things down. I'm going to do that good and bad. I want to chart that. You were talking about that. And then I want to do the inventory. I'm going to, in the next couple of days, I want to sit down and take an inventory of some of these wins that I've had in my life and write them down. So I hope our audience will do some of those same things. So thank you. Appreciate you so much.
Thank you, Pat.
What an incredible story of turning tragedy into hope. Naseem's story reminds us that while we can't always choose what happens to us, we can choose how we respond. If this conversation encouraged you, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. We'll see you next time on the No Gray Areas podcast.